in 2009, Spirit Bear, who's a teddy bear that represents all First Nations children, and I sat in a courtroom alone. We were there to challenge the Canadian government's long-standing policy of providing First Nations children with lesser public services than all other Canadian kids received. It's been going on since Confederation. The federal government funds services on reserve. And since Confederation, it's known it funds it at far lesser levels. It's known the harms that it creates, like unnecessary family separations, contributing to the deaths of some children, contributing to the harms and hopelessness of many children. It has solutions to fix it, and yet it wasn't fixing it. So, along with the Assembly of First Nations, in 2007, we had filed a legal case. And we had asked why Canadians to come into the courtroom, to fill their offices of their members of parliament, to demand equity and an end to this long-term systemic discrimination that was piling up on the hopes and dreams of children. And yet Spirit Bear and I were alone in that courtroom. Why was that? Was it that Canadians didn't care that First Nations kids? Did they think they weren't worth the money? Well, just as those thoughts were glimpsing past our minds, in came a group of high school students. And as one young man told me, they were from alternative school, which means they got into trouble a lot. And I said, good, because so do I. You see, one of the things about getting into trouble, like John Lewis has said, is you can get into trouble for doing the wrong thing. And that's really easy to do. That's for amateurs. But getting into trouble for doing the right thing, like John Lewis did in the civil rights movement, or like Spirit Bear, who is trying to counter the racial discrimination by the Canadian government, that's for experts. And children are experts in love and fairness. And so these youth could see what many adults in Canada could not see. That giving First Nations children, young people, less of an opportunity to live well in this country was unfair, and someone needed to do something about it. So not only did they stay in the courtroom for that entire hearing, and I'm telling you, sometimes it was pretty boring listening to the lawyers, but they came back at the next set of hearings with their younger brothers and sisters, with their grandparents, with their parents, and with their friends. And by 2012, there were so many children and young people in the hearing room that we had to have an overflow room. And some children had to remain outside, where they stood in front of Parliament with signs demanding fairness for First Nations children. You see, the worst thing about systemic discrimination is when it becomes normalized in a society. And that's happened in Canada. We have an Indian Act, which has been with us since Confederation. It's the same act where children were removed and placed in residential schools. And today, the Canadian government under that act still imposes First Nations governments. It still does things like decides who is a First Nations or non-status child. Can you imagine a non-status anyone and the government of Canada is making that call? That's systemic discrimination. When you see First Nations children being given less money by the Canadian government, and the Canadian government wanting us to be patient and thankful for its ongoing discrimination, that's systemic discrimination. When you see law enforcement and the judiciary not respecting the humanity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, that's systemic discrimination. And when you hear the word Indigenous being overused in ways that really mask the unique differences between and among First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, that's also a form of systemic discrimination. The good news is that children can see it at age 2. Developmentally, children understand fairness of all diversities. And if we nurture that and don't allow the systemic discrimination to become normal, and then equip children and young people with peaceful and respectful tools to address it, then we can actually live in a world where we honor difference and where systemic discrimination is vanquished to the past. But we have to remain vigilant. You see, when we won the court hearing in 2016, when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said that what Canada was doing all those years was racial discrimination and ordered it to stop. The children and young people, we held a celebration to mark that occasion, but also to redouble our efforts, because we understood that there had been a lot of legal rulings in the past that the Canadian government had not implemented. So we used that party to write more letters to the Canadian government. And thankfully we did that, because there's been about 10 non-compliance orders issued against the Canadian government since 2016. And while things have improved a bit, that inequality is still there. Just last week, there were First Nations children in Northern Ontario that had to leave their community because there was no water. So we need to remain vigilant when we see systemic discrimination. One of the biggest enablers of systemic discrimination is when folks like you don't do anything. You have an opportunity to change this country for the better by not normalizing the discrimination and following the example of the children and young people who not only came to those hearings, but continued to speak out about the unfairness. You have a chance to co-create a society where every child matters, where every child is worth the money, is worth the effort, is worth the time. But you also have a choice just to continue like your forefathers did, to normalize it, to look the other way because it's not about you. But I have hope, and I believe in each and every one of you and your ability to make a difference. Children have power. I've seen it, Spirit Bear has seen it, and I know that each of you have seen it. So stand up and be counted, and go onto our website, www.fncaringssociety.com, where you can find 7 free ways to make a difference, and you can be a part of history. Because the crazy thing about history is you don't know you're in a historical moment when it's happening, but you can be part of the movement that pushes Canada through a threshold where we would look back on this period of racial discrimination and think, how did we put up with it for so long? And thank heaven for everyone who stood up for justice. I believe in you. Get to work.